Welcome everyone to the session. It is my pleasure to introduce Hayden Wilkinson. Hayden works in the emerging field of global priorities research, both as a researcher and previously in operations. He spent 2018 at the newly established Global Priorities Institute at the University of Oxford, working as their interim head of research operations. He then spent a year at Princeton University as a visiting student researcher under a Fulbright scholarship. At the moment, he is finishing up his PhD in philosophy at the Australian National University. Hayden's research lies primarily within population ethics and decision theory, and his dissertation focuses on the difficulties of moral decision-making in an infinite universe. For his academic work, he has been awarded the Australasian Association of Philosophy's Prize for Best Postgraduate Paper in 2017, as well as the inaugural Global Priorities Fellowship by the Forethought Foundation in 2019. Apart from his academic work, Hayden co-founded and led the effective altruism groups at both the University of Queensland and Australian National University. He has also done extensive volunteer work, including as a relief worker at a refugee camp in Greece and as a firefighter within the New South Wales Rural Fire Service. Please welcome Hayden.
Thanks, Claire, and thank you all for coming this late in the conference especially. I'm glad you're still here. So, to start with, here's a situation which might hit quite close to home for a lot of effective altruists. So there's a hypothetical person called Agape, and she donates 10% of her income each year to effective charities. This 10% brings far greater happiness or welfare or whatever she considers morally valuable to the recipients than it would bring to her. And 10% is no small thing. It's a pretty good attempt. But Agape has a comfortable life. She could donate, is that up there? Yeah. She could donate up to 90% before it got really tough, before each dollar would do more good for her than it would for those in poverty, or those on factory farms, etc., whom she might benefit with it. By only giving 10%, is Agape doing the wrong thing? Now personally, I give away a lot less than 90% of my income. So this is a worry that I have quite often. Am I doing something deeply immoral by not sacrificing a lot more than I do? I suspect that many in the EA community have this same worry and perhaps even feel a little bit guilty about not doing everything they can. This doesn't just apply to donations, it's similar for careers. You might, for example, go into a less high-impact career, maybe in academia, doing research which is only kind of beneficial to the world, but research which you really enjoy. Or, for instance, you could go do a job that you don't enjoy at all. Maybe earning to give in finance could be an example of this, if that's something that you personally wouldn't be able to bear. Not that that's necessarily very impactful, but imagine your own hypothetical career path that you'd find unbearable, but which still would be very high impact. So the question is, by choosing a career which is more enjoyable but a bit less impactful, am I doing the wrong thing, just like with the donations? Or, even worse than doing the wrong thing, am I not being a true effective altruist? That would be terrible. Now, here's a pretty standard definition of effective altruism. It's using some amount of our resources to help others, and using the best available evidence and reasoning to ensure that those resources are spent in a way which has as much positive impact as possible. Now, as a philosopher, I immediately see there's no moral claim here. Effective altruism is something you do, not some belief of what you're obligated to do. And regardless of someone's moral beliefs, if they use some amount of their time or money or whatever they happen to have at their disposal to effectively help others, then they're doing effective altruism. In Agape's case, giving less than she could, there's no direct conflict between that and effective altruism. Likewise, there wouldn't be any conflict even if you didn't believe in moral obligations. You might just kind of prefer for people to not suffer and die unnecessarily. I certainly prefer that beyond what I morally think I ought to do. In that case, you can still be an effective altruist. But many effective altruists do think that we have moral obligations to engage in effective altruism. Peter Singer certainly does, Will MacAskill, Toby Ord, and plenty of others. I believe that I'm obligated to help others, and I suspect that many of you do too. For the rest of this talk, I'm going to take that belief as a starting point. Here's one particular view which motivates some effective altruists, and I'll just assume it's true for the rest of this talk. It's a view that I'm pretty sure Peter Singer holds, many of you might hold, and which comes out of a variety of conventional moral views. It says, whenever our resources would produce greater moral value if spent on others than if we spent them on ourselves, we are obligated to spend those resources on others. For example, if I have $1 and that dollar would bring more happiness to someone in Malawi than it would bring to me, then I'm obligated to give that dollar away. Likewise for the next dollar, and every dollar I have until I end up poorer than those people I was helping, or rather, until the marginal dollar would be more valuable for me. Yeah. And anyone who believes this first view will be led to think that we should, use a large portion of our resources to help others. Say, giving 90% of our income to charity each year, or to use all 80,000 hours in our careers to do whatever helps others most, no matter how unpleasant the job is. Of course, this here shouldn't at all be read as saying that we should give 99% of our income away, that we should sell every piece of clothing we own and wear potato sacks to work, that we should literally bring ourselves down to the poverty line, maybe not even spending money on water to shower. No, that would actually be counterproductive, you might notice, especially in a hot climate as we are. If you want to keep earning money, or keep having an impact in other ways too, you probably need to smell okay. You need to not show up to work in a potato sack, depending on your job. If it's a startup, maybe that's okay. Otherwise you'll get fired. Maybe academia is okay too, actually. So you do need a place to live, a good night's sleep, a decent diet, and so on, or your productivity, in addition to your earnings, will drop even more sharply, or it'll drop very sharply, perhaps even more sharply than child mortality in the last 30 years. So anyway, I don't think this view here implies that we all need to stop showering, wear potato sacks, and give away 99% of our money. But basic hygiene, clothing, a bed to sleep in, etc., that's still not going to cost the majority of your income if you're going for the absolute cheapest options for those. Maybe 10% would cover that, leaving you 90% to give away. Or maybe basic living costs are more than 10% for you. That's fine. It's going to vary radically by person. So feel free to fill in different numbers in your head when we're talking about this, based on your own circumstances. If it costs 50% of your income to maintain basic hygiene and so on, then we're asking, am I doing something wrong by giving less than 50% rather than 90%? But whether it's 90% or 50%, this view here seems to entail that almost all of us should do a lot more than we currently do. So are most of us doing something deeply wrong? Should Peter Singer be disappointed in us? The real question. I'm going to spend the rest of this talk arguing that no, even by this view, which I think may very well be true, it's okay to do less than 90%. In fact, we might be morally obligated to do less. So Peter Singer should still be happy with us. Now, to make the case for this, I'll first have to introduce you to Professor Procrastinate, a classic case from philosophy. So, I won't try reading it from up there. A student is applying for a grad job at the last minute, as usual, and needs a reference. She emails Professor Procrastinate on Monday, asking him to write her a reference letter. If he says yes, she will send him more info on Tuesday, and the reference is then due on Friday. Now, Procrastinate is the best person to do the reference, and he can do it on time. However, he knows that he almost certainly will not do it on time, with probability less than 5%, which is perhaps not atypical. He is a habitual procrastinator, and he will almost certainly freely choose not to finish it when the time comes around. This failure would not at all be due to outside factors, like a natural disaster. He just knows he's going to mess up. What's more, his failure would have very bad consequences. The student would not have time to seek another reference, so would not get a job. Finally, if he says no on Monday, the student will instead ask Dr. Reliable, who actually would write the reference on time. Now, that reference wouldn't be quite as good as Procrastinate's, perhaps good enough to get the same job at a lower salary, but this would be much better than no reference at all. So, what should he do on Monday? Say yes or say no? I'm not going to do the whole straw poll thing, don't worry. Cool. Yeah. Now, you could argue that he should say yes. After all, he should do whatever has the best outcome in this case. There don't seem to be many other considerations present. And if we look at the whole week, what has the best outcome? Well, saying yes and then writing the reference. After all, he can choose to do both those things. No matter how bad a procrastinator, he's capable of writing the reference if he chooses to. Feel free to tell this to your professors next time you're asking for references. So if we ask what he should do over the whole week, he should most certainly say yes and write the reference. And you might think that that claim implies that he should also say yes. It seems to. Now, this line of thinking matches up with a philosophical view called possibilism. I won't bore you with technical definitions, but very roughly, it says that you should take the very best sequence of actions. If an action like saying yes to the student on Monday is part of that best possible sequence, then you should do it, even if you're certain that your future self is going to choose not to write the reference. Okay. You could instead argue that he should say no. After all, he can't choose on Monday to both say yes and write the reference. That combined option isn't available to him. He might try to form a strong intention to write the reference in the following days. He might really psych himself up for it. But there's no guarantee that his future self will still act on that intention. He can only choose whether he says yes or no, not what he does Tuesday to Friday, at least when he's choosing on Monday. In other words, on Monday, he can't control his future self. Much like I can't control Claire's actions. If me and Claire were an academic team, Team Procrastinate, and it was up to me to answer emails, to say yes or no to the student, and then it was up to her to actually write the reference, then I shouldn't say yes unless I actually think she'll do it. If I'm almost certain that she won't do it, then I should say no, you might think. And we might think that these two situations are analogous, since Professor Procrastinate also can't control his future self. So Procrastinate on Monday should say no. Okay. And given, conditional on what his future self will likely do, he does more good by saying no, straightforwardly. So shouldn't he say no? Okay. Say his future self were almost certainly not going to write the reference for some other reason, a natural disaster maybe. Then, say a cyclone, a bushfire, then we probably all agree that if he knows that's coming, he should say no. So it's odd that it should be different when he's still almost certainly not going to do it, just for another reason, which is his own laziness. And this comes out of a philosophical, the saying no, rather than the other point, comes out of a philosophical view called actualism, which roughly says, forget about that overall best sequence of acts. What's your future self actually going to do? Whatever it is, do the best thing given that fact. And I should note that possibilism and actualism aren't the only views on offer here. There are others in the philosophical literature, but we don't lose anything important here by just focusing on these two. I should also point out something that I've thus far neglected. In reality, Procrastinate won't be certain of what his future self will do. I've been sort of careful in my wording and saying, almost in brackets, certainly. He's not certain what his future self will do, just like we're never quite certain what our future selves will do. He and we can still try to predict our future behavior. We can put very rough probabilities on it. We can be almost certain, or very certain, or any probability between 0% and 100% for a lot of our future actions. For instance, if I open a packet of delicious chips right now, especially this long after lunch, I can be almost certain that my future self in a few minutes' time will eat them. Maybe 95% certain. Just as I can be fairly confident that my friends in the front rows will bug me for some as well, as soon as the talk is over. And then with some probabilities, we can choose actions in these cases of uncertainty over future actions based on how good those actions will turn out in expectation, which means, I'll get to that. But anyway, in expectation, given the chances that our future selves will sort of perform different actions. Just like if I were to try to figure out the consequences of my actions given uncertainty over like what Claire would do or any one of you would do. Okay, so Professor Procrastinate might be 95% sure that he won't write the reference. Then as long as the alternative, the student getting the reference from Dr. Reliable, is at least 5% as good, then it's better in expectation for Procrastinate to say no. But how is any of this relevant? Well, we can go back to Agape. Here's the case from before, but I'm going to add some details. So Agape really likes a bit of luxury in her life, such as her sports car. Without such luxuries, she'd be demotivated. By her best estimate, by her best estimate, if she donated 90% and had to live off 10% of her income, she'd be likely to give up donating altogether and keep absolutely everything for herself. with a probability of 50% every year. For most of us, I think this probability would be even higher than 50%. If I had zero money left to enjoy myself, if I almost had to do the potato sack thing, I'd almost definitely get demotivated and give up on this whole thing. Maybe I'd come back and donate a little bit less, but for simplicity, let's just assume once you're out, you're out. But basically, the same lessons will follow. She happens to have 40 years left in her career. So when we add up the amounts and multiply them by the different probabilities, it turns out that giving 90% of her income this year and every year results in expected total donations of 1.8 years worth of income, which isn't actually very much. It's just under 2 years of what she would earn. Now, what if she dropped down to 10%? It seems like that would make it lower, wouldn't it? Well, let's assume at 10% she has no risk of giving up. In total, that's 4 years of income, more than twice as much as before, and likely more than twice the positive impact. Now, what about 20%? Let's assume that now there's a 5% additional chance of giving up. That comes out as about 3 years worth. Again, a bit lower than if she'd given 10%. Now, this all might seem a bit surprising. At 20%, she's giving twice as much as she was at 10%. At 90%, she's giving 9 times as much. But with that additional risk, the expected total shrinks down to even less. This is because the probability of giving up is compounding over 40 years and ends up awfully high. So for instance, with a 5% per year chance of giving up, that ends up being an 86% chance of giving up by the end. So Agape's total impact is more sensitive to changes in that annual probability than it is to how much she's actually donating each year. And of course, I've just made these probabilities up. There isn't much data out there on the probability of effective altruists giving up on donating or on their careers, so I've just picked numbers out of thin air. If you want to figure out what to do in your own situation, you'll have to figure out how much more likely you are to give up if you had a certain amount less spending money. Some of you might be unaffected by that, in which case the probability is very low. Others of you, I certainly, might really struggle. Now in general, suppose you could donate twice as much each year as she does, moving from 10% to 20%. But that would make you 5% more likely to give up each year. It turns out that's actually not worth it, in general, whenever a doubling results in a 5% increase. Since the compounding 5% probability ends up cutting your impact in half, or down to slightly less than half, over 40 years, assuming you have 40 years left in your career. And I found this quite surprising when I first ran the numbers, but probability is by nature notoriously counterintuitive. So from this, putting ourselves in Agape's situation, very, very different from our own, we can at least justify donating less than 90%, assuming that would make us very likely to give up. In fact, we might be able to justify donating a lot less, depending on how sensitive our motivation is to being deprived of nice things. Assuming that we're at least a little bit sensitive, we should probably donate quite a lot less than 90%. In fact, donating a full 90% would then be reckless. You'd end up doing a lot less good. In fact, you're morally obligated not to by this line of thinking. But of course, all of this depends on whether we follow the actualist line of argument rather than the possibilist one. If we take the possibilist line that Professor Procrastinate should say yes because that's part of the best sequence of actions, then we'd also say that Agape should give 90% because the best sequence of actions is giving 90% every year, regardless of how likely she actually is to follow through and finish doing that. So, should we follow the actualist argument rather than the possibilist one? Good question. Me? There are arguments both ways. So first, here are a couple of reasons why we might reject possibilism and go for actualism. There are cases in which possibilism gives results that seem intuitively just wrong. Apologies for the text going over the picture. It'll just be there a minute. Okay. First, sometimes there's very good reason to constrain our future selves, but possibilism says we have no reason to. Say I'm hosting a party, a very exciting, raucous, well-fed party, so I need to provide a bunch of unhealthy snacks to keep people happy. I could buy those snacks on the day of the party, or I could buy them a couple of weeks in advance, which might be slightly more convenient. I'm already at the shops or something. But the thing is, I'm on a diet, and I don't want to wind up eating all of those unhealthy snacks myself. But I know that if they're in my pantry, I'm going to find them really tempting I'm almost definitely going to eat them before the party happens, perhaps much sooner, and I'm going to ruin my diet. So it seems sensible to not buy them in advance. It seems prudent to just remove that option or constrain myself. Or if I could put a lock on the pantry and leave the key with my neighbor for the next 2 weeks so I couldn't get at the food, that also seems pretty sensible, as long as I do still have food to eat. We probably think that there's some reason to do these things, to not tempt ourselves. But possibilism can't say this. The very best sequence of actions is to buy the junk food earlier, even if it's only slightly more convenient, and then just not eat it. And that's the case no matter how slight the convenience. And that just seems intuitively wrong, that that's what we should be doing. Likewise, the best sequence of actions isn't ever affected by what other less good actions are available. Possibilism can't give any reason to ever take options away from your future self. Again, that seems wrong. I personally don't trust my future self that much. Now here's a related problem. Even when the stakes are really high, possibilism says the same thing, that it still can't say that we should play it safe. So consider this case. I offer you a choice. You can choose to A, turn a hand crank once, this thing on the right, and save 1 million lives. Or B, turn that crank for 10 years straight and save 1 million lives plus an extra 10 or so. If you stop before the 10 years is up, no one is saved. So which should you choose? Okay. Now, put aside the fact that laboring for 10 years straight on this hand crank is demanding a lot of you. It's pretty costly, but still worth it if it saves the lives of 10 other people. Remember, for this talk, we're accepting the view that we're obligated to make such sacrifices when the benefit is high enough. So, looking just at what will save the most lives, should you now say yes to turning the hand crank for the next 10 years? Or should you just go for the one crank? I know I probably wouldn't have the mental fortitude to turn a hand crank day in, day out for 10 years straight. Anyone who does, good on you, but I'm not that good a person. I'd almost certainly get sick of it. I would get terribly cranky, you might say, and give up. As I'm making the decision, sure, it's possible that I might hold on to it for 10 years, but it's almost certain that I won't. And given what's at stake, 10 million lives, you might think that it's not worth the risk of my future self just flaking at some point, especially to save a thousandth of a percent more people. But no matter how high the stakes, and no matter how low the chance of sticking to your guns, possibilism says you should risk it. And you might, like me, think that that seems wrong. So those are some problems with possibilism and the broader line of argument that says Agape needs to donate 90%, or should donate 90%. Now, how about problems with the other line of argument, or with actualism? I'll focus on just one, which I think is the most compelling. If you're interested in others, I wrote a blog post about them at some point. Go read that. But the key objection is, if you're especially lazy or selfish, it seems to let you off the hook. Actualism does. And letting you off the hook like that seems a bit fishy. So if you're... Yes. If you're a bit more lazy or selfish or unmotivated than most, then you're permitted to chill out a bit, like Homer here. You're allowed to demand less of yourself, donate less, and so on. If you're a diligent, self-motivated, highly altruistic person, you're obligated to do more, like Marge. And that might make you feel like she does here. Now, there's something unnerving about a moral view saying that. It seems like we've almost got an incentive to be lazy and selfish. If we are lazy and selfish, we're allowed to skip out on some moral obligations. But I think this objection doesn't quite work. For this view to actually incentivize laziness, it would have to say that it's permissible to be lazy, at bare minimum. And it says anything but. In fact, unlike possibilism, you have extremely strong reason to rid yourself of laziness at every turn. The less lazy you are, the more good your future self is likely to do. Beyond that, the more your present self, beyond that, by this view, the more your present self will be required to do and will hopefully choose to do. So, one, this can't work as an incentive, this kind of reducing the demands. Beyond the fact that you don't actually receive any additional personal benefit one way or another, actualist reasoning actually prohibits the action that is supposedly incentivized. So two, this seems like a very far cry from letting you off the hook. Now, sure, someone who's born with weaker motivation or a stronger desire for personal comfort, they won't be obliged to sacrifice as much as someone who's more altruistic. So I might be required to do less than all of you. Yes. But they will, I will still be required to make choices which lead to me giving up as much as I can in expectation, rather than making it more okay to risk myself just sort of falling into true laziness. Anyway, in addition, actualism actually requires that people like Homer do an awful lot to improve themselves, to improve their sources of motivation, to cultivate their generosity and resilience, and to make it more likely that they keep doing good things in future. Something more like this, rather than lying on the couch. Okay, and note that Marge is in there too. People who are more altruistic and stoic may still be required to do a bit more. Now, supposing that we accept actualist reasoning, what are the implications, especially for us or for someone like Agape? Well, at least in her case, it seems better to give less each year in order to give more overall. Something like this will hold in general. We shouldn't be doing effective altruism to the extent that we're sacrificing more than we can sustainably bear. The true effective altruism is being a bit more sustainable. More generally, I think we should be much more cautious about unsustainable motivation, about risks of ourselves giving up. And remember from before, twice the annual impact isn't worth a 5% per year greater risk of giving up. Our total lifelong impact is way more sensitive to the probability of giving up than it is to how much we actually do each year. And this comes as a surprise. It's counterintuitive that that would matter so much. So I strongly suspect that most of us underestimate or underweight the importance of that risk. Closely related to that, burnout is a big issue. It's been written about a bit within effective altruist circles. Related, but not exactly the same. It's sort of additional reason to not demand too much of yourself. Okay. It may also be highly valuable to constrain our actions. This also comes out of actualist reasoning. So for instance, the giving what we can pledge, which a lot of you may have taken, is a non-legally binding pledge where you just sort of tick a box on the internet and say, yes, I will give 10% of my income every year for the rest of my working life. When I'm not working, far less. Now this changes the incentive slightly for your future self, like very, very slightly. It might be slightly socially costly to flake on your pledge later on. Other friends who are giving what we can members might come and nudge you and say, how are your donations going this year? You might get an email from Julia. I don't think that happens very often, but maybe they're doing a survey and you will get caught out and you'll feel a little bit guilty. So you're restructuring the decision problem for your future self to kind of keep them donating with slightly higher probability. And from what I understand, the statistics that Giving What We Can has collected, there's actually surprisingly high retention of people sticking to that pledge, despite the fact it has no force. Other things, so I quite like this website called BeMinder. If there's something that, looking forward, you want to achieve, like studying a certain number of hours for your exam, I think this diagram, I don't know where it says it, but it's for writing a certain number of blog posts or something. Now you at the moment might want your future self to do these things. Your future self might get lazy. So you sign up to this website and track your progress over time, and you give it your credit card details, such that whenever you fail to keep up with what you planned, it takes some of your money. I'm fairly sure you can set it to not just take the money to earn money for BeMinder, but also to send it to a political campaign of your disliking. So it can be quite effective. Unlike possibilism, actualism implies that actually this sort of thing could be really important. It could be highly valuable to use things like this. Another example is Cold Turkey, program which many of you might have on your computers. It just, you sort of set which programs and which websites you want to completely block access to for the next however many hours. And it's really hard to uninstall. I accidentally blocked a few important things recently for a month rather than a day. And I was really productive for a month. Would recommend. Yeah, and when we start thinking of sort of the probabilities of our future selves flaking on our moral commitments, these things might be even more valuable than we thought they were. Okay, Conversely, it's highly valuable to improve our motivation rather than just sort of walling in our future self. So improving our motivation, improving our resilience, our altruism, and so on. How would you do this? Well, as a philosopher, I don't really have many practical recommendations here, or like before, just a few kind of hints, vague thoughts that I had the last couple of days. Involvement in the EA community seems to be something which keeps people going. It's a source of motivation. I found that sort of watching more sad films about sort of genocide and horrific events made me, feel pretty bad. Made me empathize a bit more with the suffering of the people who my donations are helping. So maybe that's a decent strategy. I don't know. You can probably think of better ones. It's not my field. Anyway, that's about all I have to say. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for that fascinating talk. So we've got a few questions. The first one is, wouldn't Peter Singer still be disappointed if we followed this line of reasoning as he would ask us to change our desires? Well, I think you just addressed that exact point, such that we have a lower chance of giving up, it sounds like.
Yeah, my answer is yes.
What are your thoughts on donating more now compared to attempting to utilize that money to build something that compounds into a much larger donation amount in the future?
Oh, this is a great question because I have a perfect non-answer, which is you should go and watch Philip Tremel's talk from EA Global. I think there's also been a little bit of stuff written on this on the forum and elsewhere. So whether we should donate now versus whether we should save and donate in the future, I'm not misinterpreting the question, am I? Yeah. Largely depends on which of those times it would do more good. There are a few considerations here. One is how much the money will be worth at those different times. If I have $100 now, donate it, that's $100 in today's dollars. If I invest it for the next 40 years, then it's probably going to get some interest, depending on my investment decisions. It's going to grow a little bit faster than inflation, so it'll be worth more then. But if I wait until then to donate it, how much good it does also depends on the cost effectiveness of the opportunities available in 40 years. And you might think that the EA community is just growing so fast that they're going to take all the opportunities and we need to get in quick. So that kind of weighs in favor of donating now. Whereas if you think we're just not growing as fast as the problems in the world, then we should wait. Also, if you think there's going to come a time which is sort of the hinge of history, the time when our contributions are far more important. Say we're on the brink of nuclear war in 2040. I really hope not, but if that's the case, maybe sort of a sudden influx of donations to a nuclear advocacy charity will be really valuable. But third consideration, which I think is sort of usually not too obvious, but like in the context of this talk, very obvious, is there's a good chance we're going to get tempted to just spend it on luxury goods in those 40 years. You might want to stick it into a fund where you can't directly control it, or you can't withdraw it, like a trust of some sort. I don't know how trusts work, or a donor-advised fund. I'm obviously not my area, but I think this is a thing. You may have additional reason to go with such things if you take this reasoning seriously. But I don't have a concrete suggestion of when you should all donate. Ask an economist. Philip Tremel's EAG talk is related to sort of the hinginess of history. Anyway, go and watch his talk. He explains what he's actually talking about better than I will.
So there are two related questions here. One is asking if you can please edit every EA resource on the hub so that it contains this many puns. And the second is asking about other puns that you didn't use in the talk. I'm gonna, for the sake of everyone else, I might just leave that. So someone's asking, the assumption that someone would completely give up donating for the rest of their life when they'd previously donated seems rather unlikely. So how does your analysis change if you modify the probability from, say, 5% to 1%?
Okay, so you've got the probability of giving up completely and never coming back. You've also got the probability of downscaling a little bit after a particularly hard year. I think if your personality or your motivation or such is it's pretty safe that you won't give up completely, but you will sort of come back down to make it comfortable again and sort of come to an equilibrium of sort of where it's as much as you can do without then sort of inevitably bringing yourself back down, then actually you're a pretty safe character. I hope there are lots of people like that, and I've just ignored that possibility for simplicity. I think that's for people to judge themselves if they're in that position. But if you're in the situation, if you're like me and you have a habit of like going a bit too hard at things, sort of overcommitting, burning out catastrophically, and then throwing up your hands and going and living on a commune, that's not so much me, but like some people might. If you can see yourself possibly doing that, then this is a risk worth mitigating. Likewise in careers, I think careers are maybe far more relevant to this sort of thinking, or like it's a more suitable application in that, say you decide at the age of 20 to go into finance, earning to give or something, and you know that you will hate it, or it just so happens that you do end up hating it. If you've been in finance for 10 years, you probably can't then like come out and go into something like, I mean, you can, but it'll take a while to retrain to like then go into certain other career paths which are slightly less impactful but more sustainable. I'm not sure, but it seems like the risks of complete dropout are higher with careers than for donations. So I think it's still worth worrying about, but entirely dependent on sort of your own circumstances and probability estimates.
Thank you. There's another question about ways to increase motivation over time. Do you see being more inclusive or accessible as another motivation for doing less good? People balk at the idea of giving 10% already, and maybe it helps to promote EA if we are all happy, functional, non-paper bag living humans.
Yes. So I guess there are two intended audiences for this talk. And both of these audiences are not worried about movement growth. But for different reasons. So one audience is people who are turned off EA because they think, well, if I sort of accept the moral claims that leading EAs have put forward, so Peter Singer's view, not that all of us necessarily hold that view, then I'm admitting that I'm doing something wrong unless I go, the whole hog. And so I'm not even going to do a little bit because I don't want to accept that responsibility. I think at least some people have that way of thinking. So to those people, no. Second audience is sort of EAs who are, I don't want to say too ambitious, but like push themselves a bit too hard without thinking about the sustainability of what they're doing. I have known people who have kind of been headed full steam towards highly impactful careers, like very hard careers, but highly rewarding and highly impactful ones, and they just like didn't take care of themselves to the necessary degree and were derailed, unfortunately. So also to the audience of people who are sort of on that track, moving at that speed, I'd suggest sort of be very cautious about your own risk of burning out, your own risk of your future self not agreeing with your current plans. I think that's just generally underappreciated. Those people as well, if they're sort of individually striving for as much individual impact as possible, but rather than sort of growing the community and looking at movement building stuff, they probably think that, oh, well, me burning out or me being like a bit too zealous, other people don't need to see that. I can do it sort of closeted in, no one will notice what I'm up to. Yeah, so I'd be very keen for both those groups to sort of like be updated a little bit. But of course, it's entirely overdetermined that we should not advocate for 90% donations and whatever, because of course then the movement is not going to grow at all, or very slowly. So yeah, multiple very good reasons. That's a separate one that I haven't touched on here. But yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. So someone's asking, what do you think about the option of donating a higher, possibly unsustainable amount with the plan to revert to a lower, more sustainable amount if you fail to keep it up? And I suppose this might also relate to deciding to almost burn yourself out and then change course if you can see the burnout coming.
Yeah, I think if you go into it with that intention, certainly your odds are better. But again, depends very much on your personal situation. If you think there is a risk that despite this carefully laid plan, you will nonetheless be so demotivated that you drop out completely, then worth taking that risk into account. The second part was career-wise, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was just my add-on. I suppose the same principle might apply to careers.
Yeah, I think with careers especially, there is a sort of cost of moving from one to another, so it's even more important in that case. Yeah.
Can we all thank Hayden once again?